Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Leah Markey, the director of the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry Library here in Chicago, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's installment of Race and Dialogue, a conversation series from the center that features cross-generational discussions between scholars of pre-modern critical race studies and critical Indigenous studies. And I'm proud to state that this is our 8th conversation in the series. I particularly love today's title, Disrupting Art History, Critical Indigenous Perspectives in Colonial California and Mexico. And we're so honored to have 2 brilliant art historians with us today who are transforming the way we think about Indigenous and colonial Latin American art and culture. You'll get the chance to learn from Professor Yve Chavez from the University of Oklahoma and Professor Dominique Polanco from Virginia Tech momentarily. We're putting their bios into the chat now just to save a little time. And we will also include some info about publications in the chat during the conversation. So before we dig into the conversation, I'll read the Newberry's land acknowledgement. As part of our commitment to addressing the ongoing legacies of dispossession and settler colonialism, as well as our relationship with the city, the land, and the environment, the Newberry Library has crafted this acknowledgement in partnership with the Chicago American Indian Center. Located near the confluence of several waterways, the Newberry Library sits on land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations, the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, the Dawa, and Ojibwe nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria-Kaskaskia nations, and the Miami Wea, Akiwaki, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and the Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous people continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways. Today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. As a Chicago institution, it is the Newberry's responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose land we're situated. And since this is a virtual event, you all, our panelists and audience members, are joining us from many different places. And wherever you currently are, we encourage you to learn how you may be of service to the people on whose land you are situated and seek to understand your place within the history that has brought you to reside there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professors Chavez and Polanco, and thank you for being here. And I just also wanted to note that we'll start taking questions from the audience at about 30 to 40 minutes into the conversation. So feel free to put questions into the Q&A at any point in the discussion, and we will start compiling them. So welcome, Dominique and Yve. Thanks for being here, and we look forward to your conversation.
Thank you, Leah. I wanted to begin very quickly by thanking everyone who's helped organize this, especially Yve, but I wanted to begin also by thanking everyone who is, again, organized from the Newberry Center for Renaissance Studies, Leah, Chris, Becky, and Yasmin. Thank you so much for helping this come together. I also wanted to acknowledge I'm currently on Low Monacan land, presently in Blacksburg, Virginia, at Virginia Tech. And so I wanted to begin with that important acknowledgement of where I am today. And mostly we're going to run this as a Q&A conversation. And I wanted to begin with Yve. I have several questions that have emerged from looking at her research and getting to know her over the last couple of months. And one that always comes to mind that I'm always so interested in knowing about any scholar, but especially Yve, is kind of how did you come to the research and art history and kind of your career as a whole? I'm sure it's a very long trajectory, but as much as you'd like to share, I'd love to hear.
Yes. Thank you, Dominique. And before I answer, I would like to also thank the Newberry Library for the invitation to be part of this conversation, and especially to Leah Markey and to Dominique Polanco for including me. And I am also a guest in the place where I'm living here in Norman, Oklahoma, where I'm speaking from, which is the traditional home of the Hasinai Caddo Nation and the Kirikiris, Wichita, and affiliated tribes. And the land where University of Oklahoma is located, once also served as a hunting ground, trade exchange point, and migration route for the Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage nations. So though I myself am Native American, my ancestral homelands are in Los Angeles. And I could start by taking that point in the conversation to answer your question. So how did I arrive at my research? So I am a member of the Gabrielino Tongva San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, and we are one of several bands of the descendants of Tongva speaking peoples from the Los Angeles basin. And our ancestors inhabited the region within what is now Los Angeles County, parts of northern Orange County, also the southern Channel Islands. There are 8 Channel Islands off the coast of Southern California, the 4 northern ones being Chumash. And I grew up in part in my ancestral homelands in Los Angeles, and my main reference point for our culture was the Mission San Gabriel. And some people may not understand why, why a colonial institution. And it's in part because we don't have a reservation. We are not federally recognized, though we have state status. And because of the history of Spanish colonization in California, many tribes have faced great obstacles in achieving federal recognition. So the mission has been part of my ancestral heritage for a long time. My grandparents were married there. My mom was baptized there. So there is a legacy going far back, and my ancestors' names are in the mission registries as some of the first people who were brought to live and work at the mission. And for me, it's important in my scholarship to acknowledge that it's an Indigenous space, despite the commonly held perception that the missions are these Spanish colonial institutions. And there is a layer to that. But how did I even get to the point of analyzing these missions? Well, I needed education. So in undergraduate studies, I decided to pursue an art history major. I was always drawn to art, and I took a few art history classes and really liked it. But there were no Native American art classes at Stanford, where I was an undergraduate. And I ended up minoring in Native American studies so that I could have the context for better understanding Native American cultural complexity and the circumstances that my ancestors faced. So with the bachelor's degree in hand, I decided, well, I should go to graduate school because I wanted to keep pursuing a path in the art world, initially thinking I would go into museum work. And I went to the University of Washington and did my master's there. And my master's thesis looked at a group of baskets that were in the Burke Museum collection there at the University of Washington. And I was drawn to this group of baskets because they were out of place in the first place, being in the Pacific Northwest, being labeled as mission Indian baskets. And I went down a rabbit hole and found that this was a labeling approach that anthropologist Alfred Kroeber introduced in the early 20th century to describe certain types of coiled baskets that were made in Southern California. And the mission label is deceiving, and I explained it in an article I published in, I think, 2019. So that article is based on that research I did for my master's. But I was always drawn to the missions and wondered what Native people had done. Because when you visit the missions, there isn't a clear explanation in the museums as to what Native people were doing or what their artistic practices looked like within that context. So for my PhD, which I pursued at UCLA, I had to train, get the training I needed in both colonial Latin American art to understand the context in which the Spanish colonial enterprise brought about, the mission system, and then also Indigenous American art studies. So that is sort of my educational trajectory and training that brought me to be equipped to discuss the Indigenous contributions within the context of the California missions. And I did not examine all 21 missions. That is way too many. And I think other people who are from the communities impacted by those other missions should be the ones to do that work. But I focused my dissertation on the southern missions, mainly San Gabriel being in my Tongva homelands, and then 3 of the Chumash missions. So now my book manuscript is building on that. So I think I may be getting ahead of you in terms of answering questions, but I can turn it back to you, Dominique.
No, that's wonderful. And again, I think those layers of needing both, as you said, personal connection, but the necessity of education, right? Formal education and sort of the university setting is necessary. I had a question based on that, especially as it sounds like you've had to marry these kind of disciplines that might seem separate but are necessary to your particular research in terms of Native American studies and Native American art history, and then kind of colonial Latin America, Mexico in particular, for training. And so what are some of the nitty-gritty, literal aspects to the training that you've needed in terms of potentially language or archival research, things that may or may not be traditionally even considered art history, right? In this Western sense. So what have you had to do to build your skill set to actually, partake in the research you've done?
Well, language is tricky. So I didn't do the typical languages that art historians are trained in. So I didn't do German, which wouldn't be relevant for this topic of the California missions, though I did study Spanish and French. Indigenous languages I did not pursue, and for our tribe, there aren't any fluent speakers. And I don't know that there really are any fluent speakers from the missionized tribes. In general, there are efforts to revive our languages based on the recordings that anthropologists made of elders speaking in the early 20th century. And that is an area I would like to spend more time pursuing. But other skill sets that I had to learn for the purposes of doing this research is going to archives, like you mentioned. So that's, I would say, more typical for art history is going to archives, but also looking at archival collections that are from maybe other disciplines. So anthropological collections, the National Anthropological Archives, and then I visited more typical archives, like the Bancroft Library, which has collections of California mission-related material, the Santa Barbara Mission Archive. I went to an archive in Baja California, and the Archivo de las Indias in Seville. So as I found, unfortunately, with the archives of Spanish documents and Mexican documents related to the missions, there really isn't discussion of what Indigenous people are doing in an artistic sense. So there's something to be learned from that as well, the absence of information in the archive and the priorities of colonists and what they were recording and privileging. And because of that, I've seen a trend with explorers documents, so scientific expeditions that came to California during the mission era, they seem to take perhaps more of an interest in what Native people were making, at least to bother collecting materials, taking them away from their home regions and placing them in museum, initially private museum collections, and then what are now more mainstream museums. But those have been valuable resources in seeing also what was interesting, what was of interest to European explorers, and also the fact that they were not recording the names of individual makers, which is another obstacle when writing about Native artists from the late 18th, early 19th century, is that it would be nice to dignify the makers by name. And in very rare instances, do we know their names? And I've tried my best to acknowledge those individuals in my work, but many people remain unnamed. Their work is not linked to them in the archive. So there is that challenge, but other ways to honor these ancestors is to look at the continuity of the practices that they enabled by doing the work they did, whether that was basket weaving or sculpting in stone or building. So their architectural practices, and then also the ephemeral practices like dance and the attendant, regalia that they made, and how that is something we can't necessarily witness in a museum aside from the regalia, but the performative aspect is, it's ephemeral. So we can't see like a video recording. We're so dependent now on modern technology to record everything, just like this conversation is being recorded. But back then, it was just in the rare exception of the scientific expedition members making drawings or paintings of dancers, but keeping in mind that those also reflect the biases of the artists themselves. So I've turned to various resources for doing this type of research and try my best to be respectful and speak with other community members. And I speak regularly with the chief of our tribe to make sure that the work I'm doing is appropriate.
Yeah, I think those layers of complexities and kind of walls you might hit, as you're saying, with the lack of names and ephemeral nature of whatever might have been recorded in a very through the lens of not even European extraction, but then also limited knowledge that might have the explorers might have had to begin with, right? Can you explain, thinking about some of the articles I've already read of yours, and a chapter as well, a couple chapters actually, thinking very specifically about basketry. You've mentioned this idea of exploration and maybe what would be considered kind of naturalist exploration in the European sense. How does materiality focused on basketry play into maybe what could have been recorded, as you're saying, from like a Western interest in materials, but also what have you been able to assess from, as you're saying, speaking to community members and kind of maybe reading with a different lens, the historical accounts and how that relates specifically to basketry?
So I think you're asking about the materials themselves. So one thing that I noticed and talk about in the article or book chapter I recently published in the edited volume that Wendy Bellion and when Christelle Smentek published this year, that the plants were not actually recorded correctly. So the explorers were interested in the baskets enough to take them back to England in the case of the Vancouver expedition, but didn't bother to find out what species they were, or so it seems. They didn't write down specific species names of the plants, but other scholars who are more, have the skill set to analyze basket plants have identified those, and I reference their work. So they are familiar with the types of basket plants that would have been used in specific regions, since there are regional variations depending on what's available, what weavers had access to and what they typically would have used. So that's something that was missing. And again, the names of the makers, the weavers themselves, that we don't know who made certain baskets. So in the case of that one book chapter you're talking about, when I'm looking at the basket hat, we don't know who made it, unfortunately, and it would have been nice to know, but it is most likely Chumash, just given the location where it was acquired at one of the missions in the Chumash region, and the style and the plants. So that it's kind of like putting a puzzle together, getting all these pieces of evidence to arrive at the best conclusion. But I don't know that we'll ever find out who made it, because unfortunately, even the Franciscans didn't write in their inventories, oh, so and so made this thing. That it's just completely overlooked. So that's one way to go about that type of research.
I wanted to shift gears about some of the other work that you're writing, I guess, in particular, your book that you co-edited and then co-authored some pieces as well within Visualizing Genocide. I wanted to know a little bit about that project. I will admit that I was fortunate enough to see the panel that, as you mentioned in the, I believe Charlene mentioned in the preface, and then was acknowledged in the introduction as well, that the panel at CAA in Los Angeles, that seems like it was the impetus, correct, of the volume. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, kind of that process, but also some of the interventions within there, which I think are just incredibly important?
Yeah, so you're talking about the edited volume I did with Nancy Marie Mythlow, who is Chiricahua Apache, and she's full professor at UCLA. And we co-organized this panel at CAA. I think this was already back in 2018. So we had a panel. There were 4 of us who spoke different perspectives on Indigenous representation, and Charlene Villaseñor Black was the discussant, and she was also the person who wrote the foreword for the edited volume. So based on that experience, we decided to publish the papers. 2 of the participants were unable to contribute, but we brought in other scholars and museum professionals to contribute essays on the topic of the book, which is Visualizing Genocide, Indigenous Interventions in Art, Archives, and Museums. And that was published just last fall by University of Arizona Press. And there are also artists who contributed. So there are artist essays. Nancy worked closely with living artists to represent their voices, and some of them wrote their own essays as well. So it's a mix of looking at living arts today within an international context, really, because we have what is now United States representation. There is even an essay from Australia, Norway. I think we might even have Canada represented in there. So it's a mix. So it's an interdisciplinary project. It's not strictly art historical or museological, though there is more of a focus on interventions within museum spaces. But I think I'm getting away from your question.
No, I mean, I think that's the important part of it. As I said, like interventions. I would say from my research, if something is framed as art historical only, right, that a lot of the amazing work that you're saying, both from voices of actual artists, art historians, people who focus on museums, collections, as well as kind of personal stakes and personal identity that informs work throughout these kind of spheres. I think that's one of the really important interventions within the idea of studying maybe an object, right, in art history, that I, again, took a lot out of the book in each kind of chapter and each voice. One thing I really enjoyed about the introduction that I think is, again, kind of speaking to the interventions within art history, kind of these intersectional disciplines, was your amazing kind of analysis and literary review of coming to Native American studies and sort of the waves that happen. And as like I said, kind of the personal connections that authors may have, and art makers and those who study as well have, as coming in and out of being acceptable, I'd say, in academia. So one thing also that's recognized is this idea of survivance, which I think you've talked a lot about, but I was wondering if you could speak about this idea. I don't really want to say it's just theory, just methodology, but I think it's all of these ideas, right? All these things together, which I'd say kind of resonates throughout a lot of the essays in that book, and then other works that I've read of yours. So again, I think from Native American studies perspective, this is kind of commonplace, but from maybe art history or other kind of disciplines, this isn't a concept that's always engaged. And so could you explain that a little bit, both in your work, but then also maybe the idea as a whole?
Right. And I realize I should have spoken more to the title of the book, the edited volume, about visualizing genocide, which kind of is connected to the survivance topic, in that by saying visualizing genocide, we're talking about how often genocide is not seen, it's not documented, and there's this sort of mindset people hold, usually settler colonists, that, well, if you don't see it, it didn't happen. And the survivance piece of it is for scholars to explain, well, not only did our ancestors survive for us to be here today, but they actively resisted. So there is, even though you may not see something, there was an ongoing effort within Indigenous communities, not just in this country, but other places, to maintain their beliefs, their material culture, their artistic practices. So in terms of, speaking more to your question about survivance, that is something I've used as a framework in my own work to highlight the continuity of certain practices, mainly basketry. And the one article I published in Arts was part of a special issue that was focused on survivance in Native arts and communities. So that was overseen by Amy Lone Tree and Sasha Scott, who are both scholars working within Native American art and Native American studies. So it is a concept, maybe not necessarily a theoretical model, but a reality that is addressed more in the Native American studies realm, and is maybe newer to art history. But in my own work, I found it's important to cross those boundaries and not be restrained by an older art historical model. So I am trying my best to dignify the ancestors, since most of my work is more pre-20th century. Much scholarship on Native American art looks at living artist practice, and they themselves are living artists, are engaging with the concept of survivance, so that they can themselves, through their own work, honor those who came before them. So that's, thinking back to the edited volume, which includes those living artist voices, and in showing how they are aware of the trauma that their ancestors went through and which continues to be passed down from generation to generation.
Yes, exactly. So I think, like you said, that continuation, acknowledgement, continuation, and another thing that I really enjoyed from that edited volume was some of the artists acknowledging senses of humor, right? That there is, with genocide and the heavy reality of that, and the necessity of acknowledging it, right, within scholarship. There is also within kind of that concept of survivance, there's sense of humor, there's community, and so many other layers that aren't just in this binary of tragic and not tragic, right? Erasure and then therefore not acknowledging, but the lived reality of the ways that communities have continued in ways like humor and art that pokes fun of, again, this continuation of realities of genocide, such as, health disparagements and all the other, realities of living, at least in North America, right, of living an Indigenous experience in life, right? So again, I think that was really fascinating to hear from the voices of the artists, and seems like it would have been a lot of work, but really, really is such an important, as I said, intervention, right? And so, yeah, I have several other questions, but I wanted to a little bit about how your work, we're talking about, organizing and writing within these both edited volumes, and then also speaking within kind of edited volumes for the 18th century, most recent publication, or soon to be, right? I believe it's coming out or just came out this year.
Came out.
It just came out.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I was notified by my library that they just received it. So I'm assuming that means it just came out. You gave me a copy earlier, so I was double checking out the date. So what, thinking back to some of these disciplinary fields, what are some of your interventions thinking to art history, specifically within 18th century studies, which again, that chapter fits within?
Yeah. Well, and I noticed in the audience that some of my 18th century colleagues are listening. So hopefully I, say the right things. But I would say, that through the essay I wrote for that edited volume, I did focus on an object, mainly the basket that was made in the 18th century. But I'm also hoping through my work more broadly to push readers and other scholars who have been more confined within certain historical parameters, like we use, whether it's early modern or 18th century, to look beyond. So in the case of Native American arts particularly, as I've been saying, these are practices that are still happening. And in the case of California, especially with the Chumash baskets, there was a period of dormancy in the mid 20th century because of assimilation, that people weren't weaving, but there is an effort to revive. So even though in that essay I spoke more specifically about what was going on in the 18th century, I would hope readers would acknowledge that this is not a practice that was confined to that time frame. And also what I was trying to do, and I think, part of the goal of that volume is to emphasize how there were cultures being colonized throughout the world, but those cultures were not necessarily being absorbed into a European model, but were taking outside ideas and perhaps making them their own. So meeting their own needs, especially under difficult circumstances in many cases, with the 18th century being such a pivotal time for colonization and global imperialism. So it wasn't just Europeans taking indigenous things and making them their own or appropriating them, but indigenous people were also innovators.
Yeah, I think, again, building on that idea of the kind of stagnation, right, of thinking only within a certain period of time and only, an object being a stagnant, a basket being a stagnant object that can't speak to both past or future. In my work, I think that's also emerges a lot, that Indigenous people are only, being extracted from, but that there's no agency within that. And also that, human nature of adapting, especially those who are artists, or would be labeled as artists, right, as constantly innovating their own work, as you're saying too, with the incorporation of different thoughts, not just a one-way kind of model of European extraction only, and then lack of agency for Indigenous creators. I think it's really important to think about, again, disrupting, right, these ideas of not to downplay, like, the genocide and all these other really terrible realities of colonialism are present, but also that there is still agency for Indigenous people. And I think that that's really important to think about. And again, disrupting these ideas of boundaries and geographies and periods of time and lack of continuation, like you're saying, that these practices, and though there's maybe dormancies, are still realities for Indigenous people today, and kind of reflecting back and continuing forward, right?
Right. Well, and that makes me think of your work. You mentioned that, and I was hoping we could talk about that too, especially your work on the codices, how there is this practice that you address in your forthcoming publication, where you point out how labeling has been such a powerful tool on the part of colonizers to make Indigenous materials, Indigenous intellectual production, something that they can control. So I can see a lot of parallels with the work I'm doing, especially the basket mission, Indian basket style I was talking about earlier, how it's time now for us to move away from labels that are positioning Indigenous work as if it were the product of the European colonizers. So maybe you could speak more to the shifts within Latin American art studies, and where you see your own work making an intervention.
Sure. So I'm a specialist more in manuscripts, and so that's one thing. I found myself constantly, in my early training, I came to art history as a master's student, so I had a little bit of catching up to do, and also based on my undergraduate kind of exposure, I had a lot to catch up with in terms of Latin American studies, as it's kind of framed, and so kind of absorbed everything that was canonical in the beginning, and found more and more kind of confusion with names and labels, and what, in terms of manuscripts, calling it a codex or manuscript even. And then again, each manuscript is so unique in its reason for existing, if it's where commissioned, if in a colonial context and things like this. But again, I constantly am thinking about, in both that article that I believe is coming in the fall, and then the book manuscript that builds on my dissertation, is the manuscript for my book is commonly acknowledged and called the Codex Osuna. And in kind of my research, I found more and more about why this happens. And so it's named after the 19th century duke whose collection it was found in. And it's a lot shorter of a name than the colonial, the 16th century name that, it's very, very long. But also thinking about who gets to have their names attached. And that sort of, in my research, I argue that, a lot of this happens in the 19th century in the manuscript I study, as well as others, in the article, it's a different one, that it's in more or less the 19th century in Mexico and in Europe as well, that these manuscripts are discovered or rediscovered in collections, and whoever finds them kind of gets to get their name attached to it. And so the issues I explain in that is that it's an extension of colonialism, right? That lands are named, and in terms of New Spain, throughout Aviala, that they're named after Spanish explorers, or extensions or mimicry of European names already existing in Iberia. That form of erasure, and then how that gets absorbed, and how that becomes commonplace then later for us in scholarship, right? When we read about these things, and really kind of throwing a monkey wrench in that gear of, wait a minute. And I think, like you're saying, the idea of these communities who are the descendants of those who created the manuscripts and whose stories are in the manuscripts especially are so removed, sadly, just because of, again, genocide and erasure, and originally in the Iberian sense of colonization and then later in national, I'd say Mexico, attempts of erasure, that the names of these European American explorers or artists or whoever, the collection that it may be owned by, is another form of kind of that erasure and removal of Indigenous communities, Tlaqui, whoever created it. And so, yeah, I think naming, like your discussion of labeling as Mission Indians, right? This erasure of the naming process. And I, in that article, kind of bring it all the way back to the idea of baptism, right? This first kind of way of claiming and renaming as a way of staking claims, right? And that this needs to, when possible, be considered, and then what can be done moving forward. And I think the privilege that we have, right, as scholars is to bring this to the attention, but then also to bring it, when possible, to the communities and ask how that would work and what they would like to hear or name, or vice versa, what we can be doing.
Yeah, I liked reading that part of your essay, and how it made me think, it certainly is necessary and we don't see it enough, but I'm wondering what the obstacles are, especially for scholars working in places like Mexico, where, unlike the United States, where it might be easier to identify a given tribe or native group because of federal recognition and tribal structures today. But in Mexico, I'm not aware of there being any sort of federal recognition status. So how do you know which group to contact, or who is the representative for that Indigenous group?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really complicated, and like the US, I think it depends on, it's very unique to each community. It's very specific to each community, and some are maybe easier and some are less. I know in terms of the manuscript I'm looking at, it's produced in and around Mexico City, and there's names of the smaller towns that some of the testimonies are taken from, and then at the same time, it's just Mexico City writ large. So it's hard to, in the urban sense, the urban Native communities tend to be absorbed or erased, and I'd say throughout, right, the Americas, that's really common. Sad, but realities, right, of Native peoples when they're taken away from, or there's just layers of kind of historical erasure that happens in these really urban settings. So that's a reality. I think then there are some communities that have a very strong voice, both kind of within the nation, but I'd say even kind of on social media, which has been really amazing to see. Where my family's heritage traces back to Michoacan, and so they are predominantly, my family's Purepecha descended, and there's a very strong kind of political aspect to Purepecha communities there. And again, each one is smaller community, so you're kind of tied to the town that you're from, but also writ large. They are pretty anti-government, and there's been some very amazing movements in that case. And I know online, the Purepecha community has sort of a statement of who they are. And within that, I was so heartened to see that it's really connected to this larger idea of colonialism that they have and are deeply connected to, and what they're asking for forcefully, I think necessarily, is claims of their land and autonomy, which is not different in any way from the land back movement happening in kind of English-speaking nations now, right? That they are both tied to their land, and they also need and want autonomy of it. So again, each region is so different, but I'd say kind of in the urban setting of Mexico City, it can be a little tough to find the exact communities with kind of national, all these other, revolution, independence that's happened. A lot of communities have been renamed, are now absorbed into the larger city. There is, moments of erasure and then revival of kind of Nawa identity, which the manuscript I study is there is written by Nala people and their testimonies. And again, I think because of national agendas that happened in the 19th through the 20th century of mestizaje, right? We're all a little bit indigenous, we're all a little bit Spanish. That's what Mexico has sort of erased and, unfortunately, erased the memory of people's identity. So yeah, I think it just depends on if it's possible. The Quiquotec manuscript that I discussed in that forthcoming article, there's a lot more reference to the actual community, so it's a little bit easier to find. But again, it might be an issue of the realities of, you're not going to find an email address. You might have to physically go.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting though, you mentioned how these communities have turned to social media as a platform for making their voices heard. And as much as we may grumble about our dependency on technology, it is a valuable tool for Indigenous communities as long as they have access to internet, which can be a challenge in more rural communities, whether they are in Mexico or the United States or elsewhere. But it is perhaps more useful nowadays because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to access those communities without physically going and then doing the looking. Now you can contact them and then say, okay, I'm going to visit you. So that way it's maybe more personable and not this sort of outside anthropologist model that has made Indigenous communities angry with scholars at times.
Yes, I think absolutely. And I think recognizing that, so knowing the history and knowing the reality of lived Indigenous communities, both their history and then what's led up to maybe resistance to extractive research, I think is really, really important to understand too. So kind of, what you've had to build in terms of your toolbox, I think is really important to know. Read, Native American studies, research, and throughout all of the kind of interdisciplinary studies, that has been really, really important to understand, what privilege would I have as, a product of the diaspora, right? Like the layers of migration, immigration that's happened to bring me to this place, and then the humility that's necessary to approach a community and be okay with resistance and, not wanting to do whatever, I've set out to do. Because again, everyone has different agendas, and I think not prioritizing the academic one, I think it's also really necessary to understand too, even in a historical sense.
Right. And what you're saying reminds me with, I see they have a,
Yeah, we're
question.
getting nudged. Oh, wow, I didn't realize what time it was.
Yeah, maybe we should move on to that. I just wanted to quickly point out, making our scholarship accessible to readers beyond academia. That's something I noticed in your writing style, which I found I could relate to as well, in that you aren't using a bunch of jargon that only academics understand. I mean, you are very theoretically supporting your argument, but it's not as if someone from your family couldn't read it and understand what you're talking about. And that's something I find important in my own work too, is keeping in mind the communities we're coming from and making sure that this work we're doing is for them as well, not just the academy.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
speaking of community, maybe we should
Yeah.
I'm
seeing some of the questions. I'll go in order. So this is for Professor Chavez. What is the role of archival research and critical historical studies in your research? And how does this inform your research as a scholar of art, specifically Native American art? This is from Jonah Valverde.
Could you read? Let's see.
Yeah, yes, it is. So what is the role of archival research? I think we touched on this a little bit. You said the necessity to go to archives and critical historical studies in your research. And how is this informing your studies of art and Native American art? I'm thinking maybe more that connection between both archival research you said a little bit about, and then maybe the art itself.
Yeah, it seems there may be two parts there. So archival research which I touched on a little bit earlier, and in that I have looked in archives, the archives that one would expect to have materials from the period that I examine, being the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and found that they the information regarding Indigenous, mostly Indigenous anything, is kind of missing, unless you're looking specifically for names in baptismal records or marriage registers, which are useful, and I have looked at to uh, not only trace my own lineage back to the missions, but also to link some of the artists for whose names are known. But yeah, the archive, it's limiting. The historical archive, I would say, can be a little bit limiting, but it also is revealing in terms of how scholars of Indigenous topics need to look elsewhere for evidence. I don't know if I fully answered that question, but I see there are others.
Yeah, I think you
I don't want to
definitely,
neglect.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is there's holes, right? So having to fill them in, possibly with objects, right? The art that you study too. The next one I see is from Edward Polanco. He would love for you to expand upon the difference between survival and survivance. So you've discussed this a little bit. And if you could touch on how your work engages with encountering, quote, terminal narratives, and then thanking us to be here and how important it is that we're women of color to be discussing these issues.
I think by terminal narratives, he's referring to like teleological perspectives. Is that safe to say? So in terms of the differences between survival and survivance, I would say that the main element is, survivance has this kind of combined aspect to it where you have survival implied, but also resilience or resistance. So there is, how do I explain this? So, survival, it speaks for itself that something survived. So the people survived, but the resistance or resilience aspect indicates also that people survive not just by going with the flow or adapting, but they were also actively resisting certain changes. So in the context of my work, it's looking at how certain practices were being done sometimes in secret in order to maintain them, and engaging with countering terminal narratives. So like thinking against teleological narratives is not confining the work to just one time frame, but showing in later chapters, for instance, in my book manuscript, is saying, well, here is what happened in the early 20th century, and here is also what we're doing today, to emphasize that the survival continues in future generations. So it's not like just one generation survived and that was that, but because they survived and resisted, we're able to continue or revive these practices. So I hope that answered the question. Yeah, I mean, teleology is certainly something we as scholars have to be considerate of, and when talking about Indigenous communities, it's contrary to our ways of thinking, that we're not looking at time in a linear trajectory, but
Right.
that time is also cyclical.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, like disrupting both our education and all these other ways that we've been taught to think that, again, does favor, right, a non-Western. And why would you look at an object that's not, an ancestor essentially, right? That's not framed that way in a community, right? That's yeah, a really good point. The next one. Okay, great. So Amy says, what do you see as the opportunities and challenges for students? Yes, that's great to think about moving forward, right, with the other aspect of our work is teaching. Students entering the field of Indigenous art history right now, especially those interested in working with pre-20th century materials.
Hi, Amy. Thanks for the question. So that's one I certainly need to think about right now as I am training graduate students. So I think it's important that even if someone is interested more in pre-20th century material, that they look at living artists' work to understand how those practices have changed over time and why it is relevant to study the pre-20th century materials and thinking about them as resources for communities that are perhaps trying to revive them, thinking about what I was saying earlier and how even pre-20th century techniques are being used by living artists almost as a tool for addressing colonial histories. I'm thinking about some Native American basket weavers like Kelly Church, who is working in black ash basketry, but now is seeing that the black ash trees are being threatened by invasive species. So she's using her ancestors' practice of making the basketry to highlight the threat of the invasive species while also incorporating new materials to be adaptive to her circumstances. So you certainly can't study these practices in historical isolation, but look at them more broadly. So going back to the previous question about teleology, I know I keep using that word even though he didn't.
No, I mean, I think, yeah, that is really the concept of teleology is really embedded in, I would think object heavy studies, right, of art history is that it just appears and let's only study this object sort of in a vacuum. I think, like you're saying, many artists, Native artists are incredibly informed by both their history and practices and the larger forms of their practices, like connection to land and the resources that they draw from. And as you know, the research I've done, you know, when to harvest, right? When to do certain things in terms of processing the materials to create basketry is really important. That comes from oral traditions and religion and things that are not necessarily written into archives, right? For survivance, likely the resistance, right? Why would this be available? So like you're saying, it is important to know the history, to understand the present, to think about the future, like you're saying, with ecology too. Yeah, that's a great reality, I think, for us to be thinking about for our teaching.
Is Leah telling?
Yeah,
me?
Leah's popped in.
And I think that's a beautiful way to conclude. And I'm sorry to see that we have some great questions that we can't get to, but we will pass them on to the speakers and continue the conversation. And I just want to thank everybody for being here, and especially thank Yve and Dominique for this illuminating conversation. I also wanted to thank the Newberry's McNichol Center for co-sponsoring the conversation and let you all know that this dialogue's been recorded and that we'll get it on our YouTube channel soon. So I think it'll be really useful for teaching and for all sorts of activities in the future. Here's our link. So keep that in mind. And we hope to see you next time. We are excited that we have some great partners lined up for next year already. I don't think we have dates yet, but we'll get those out soon to you all. So thank you so much, Yve and Dominique. It's great having you.
Thank you. Thank you to the audience too. Those questions were great.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Stay well, everybody.